Good to see people here as well. It's always that worry that people won't turn up and you'll be talking to an empty room. So it's lovely to see you. Thank you very much for coming along. So yeah, my name is Zach Moyer, as I say, and what I am going to do is set my timer now so I know that I don't rattle on for too long. Yeah, my name's Zach Moyer. I'm from Edinburgh Napier University, and some of you might recognise the name of that university. Well, I know some of you will, because I can see people that attend that university in the room. But some of you might recognise that name because it's where the conference was going to be held last year, had COVID not got in the way. But hopefully that's still something that will happen in the years to come. So one day we'll look forward to welcoming you all there. So yeah, I work at Edinburgh Napier. It's a great university, and I'll talk a wee bit more about it as I go through, because some of the things that I've got to say relate to my practice there specifically. So hopefully you can all see the screen. Can you see the slides okay? Yeah. Nice one, thank you. And you can see that my email address is there, my kind of Twitter username's there. If anyone wants to get in touch, if anyone's got any comments or they want to discuss anything afterwards, then please feel free to get in touch. I would love to hear from you. Especially because, you know, I'm not there in person, and it is lovely to be here. I always love going to APME gatherings and catching up with friends and colleagues. So it's a shame to not be there, but I'm really proud to be part of this organisation and proud to be part of a group that has taken the initiative to turn this into a hybrid conference. And more importantly, to a group that's taken the initiative to let people share the links to the presentations. That's a really cool touch, I think, because it means that people who might not be engaging with the conference otherwise are able to, and we're expanding the reach. So I'm just really chuffed to be involved, and thank you for turning up. It's great. This session's about an hour long, which is nice because it means I get to kind of talk slowly and stretch out a little bit. And what I plan to do is speak for maybe around 40 minutes, roughly speaking. And then what I'll do is I'll stop in the hope that maybe we get around 15 minutes for discussion before the changeover period. That'll allow you to get to your next sessions. And whilst I'd totally be happy to answer any questions that people have got, of course, if any direct questions are raised, that would be great. But I'd also like it if we could maybe have a discussion afterwards, yeah? So rather than just, I've got a question about something, it would be cool if we could have a chat. I'd love to hear the perspective of the people who are listening as well, just to see what people think. So hopefully that'll be the case, if we can do that. So to give you a bit of introduction and context to what I'm going to talk about here, as I said, the title is "We Are Not Neutral: Popular Music Education, Creativity and the Active Creation of a Graduate Precariat." That is also the title of a forthcoming chapter that I've got in a book called Places and Purposes of Popular Music Education, which I believe will be published by Intellect next year, and will be edited by our very own Gareth Dillon Smith, who's in the top left of my screen at the moment, and Brian Powell as well. So it's great to be a part of that. So really what this presentation is kind of like an extended version of that chapter. But that chapter in itself is the foreground, that's the wrong word, that's not what I mean at all. I mean the foreshadowing of a book that I'm working on at the moment. Now, that book is tentatively entitled An Anti-Capitalist Manifesto for Popular Music Education in Higher Education, but we'll see what the publishers think about that, because I fully appreciate that that's quite strident. But yeah, that's what I'm holding out for. And if the book ever comes to fruition, you can imagine that was the title, even if it doesn't go that way. So that gives you a bit of a flavour of kind of roughly where I'm going with this. And I'm going to do that by talking around three sort of main areas. The first one that I want to talk about is the myth of neutrality. And by that, I mean the neutrality of educators. I'm then going to go on and talk about creativity, but I'm going to do so in a way that's maybe not the norm for music educators, because I'm going to talk about the fact that creativity is sometimes used euphemistically, and that's problematic. And then I'm going to go on and talk about this notion of a graduate precariat, because I think we are, if not already guilty of, some of us, we're certainly sailing very close to the wind in inadvertently creating a graduate precariat, or indeed actively creating a graduate precariat. So to give some contextual introduction to what I'm going to talk about now, despite criticisms to the contrary, I really don't see it as hyperbolic at all to suggest that in many ways, the world that we live in is in something of a terrible condition, right? Now, when I say the world, I do mean the planet, but I also mean the complex network of social, interpersonal, interinstitutional relationships that are fraught with challenges and difficulties at the present moment. I would say the present moment is characterized by massive inequality in terms of wealth, power, rights, influence. And I think this can be read from the angle of class or race or gender or sexuality or disability. In addition, we live on a finite planet, but we continue to behave, certainly in the Western world, and we continue to consume and we continue to exploit natural resources with a mindset of infinite growth, despite the finite nature of the planet, which seems, if anything, to be rapidly expanding at the moment. Okay, so I guess what I'm saying is things aren't good at the moment, or at least where I'm sitting. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we as kind of mere music educators will be able to rise up and overthrow governments or cause the immediate downfall of capitalism and usher in some sort of socialist utopia, thus solving all the ills of the world, as nice as that might be. Of course I'm not, but to suggest that that would be the case would be naive, and I think it would also be irresponsible. Similarly, though, to suggest that music, as in the thing music, as powerful and beautiful as it is and can be, is some sort of artistic panacea, and that it has the power to heal the world and bring harmony to the land, to my mind, despite how powerful it is and how useful it can be in social connection, is also ridiculous. On the other hand, though, just because we, in the positions that we occupy as music educators and academics, can't swoop in and fix things and immediately correct the broken system in the sense of the sweeping generalizations that I've just noticed, doesn't mean that we're entirely impotent or incapable of influencing the world around us. Far from it, to my mind. So every day we work with students, and that is to say humans, that is to say people with lives, people that exist in the world, in social and pedagogical contexts in ways that influence and shape their ideas, their beliefs, and their thinking in significant and profound ways. And indeed, that's why many of us love the jobs that we do. That's why being an educator is so important and so appealing, certainly for me. But beyond that, we also set up and work within and perpetuate and even reify and champion institutional structures in which pedagogic interaction and engagement takes place. None of this exists in a vacuum. And to suggest so, or to either extract ourselves from these structures or imagine that we float above them uncontaminated by institutional concerns or policies, is simply incorrect and not representative of the realities of the world in which we live. Now, for me, and this is for me specifically, as I talk at the moment, capitalism, and then the extension of that as in its form of the neoliberalized academy, is one of the central issues here, as far as I'm concerned, and one of the central problems. So for the purposes of this presentation, this angle is going to be my focus. And as I say, though this work is only one part of a wider study, I'm using it as an example of some of the things that I'm getting at in the arguments that I'm making more broadly. Now, what I should say, though, is that I'm motivated by issues of social class and economic inequalities, and should make it clear that I would define my approach to education and the analysis of institutionalized education as being Marxist in character. Now, that's not to say that I'm only interested in issues of class, although they are certainly the ones that relate most to my lived experience when it comes to social inequality. Clearly, there are many other lenses and there are many other issues that impact on that, some of which I've mentioned already, like race, gender, sexuality, disability, for instance. And these things are also massively important, so I don't want to undermine them. I just want to talk from my own perspective. That said, though, I do firmly believe that many of the inequalities and social injustices experienced by different groups in society have their roots in and are certainly exacerbated by the unjust economic systems that ultimately lead to the creation of dominant social forces and subaltern groups. It could even be suggested that an analysis of the links between capitalism and sexism and racism, etc., could serve to further highlight how important the struggle against any one of these things is in the struggle against any of the others, to paraphrase Vanessa Wills from 2002. So in some ways, I think regardless of your motivation for social justice or the particular cause of any oppression that we may experience, I would implore us all to consider our efficacy in this situation and hope that we might all recognize that the myth of neutrality is actually preventing many of us from engaging in and being the agents of change that we want to see. I would love to see our field embracing an ideology of popular music education as a liberatory praxis, rather than as, which I believe is currently the case in many areas of the academy, and I am generalizing here, a site of domestication into an unjust, oppressive world because of a refusal to reflect on our considerable influence as educators and the fact that we can, should we choose to, be a potent force for the development of human beings and the amelioration of the world in which we live. So ultimately then, for the sake of this presentation, and as I say, this is just one angle that I'm taking from the bigger work that I'm working on at the moment, I'm going to argue that the purpose of pop music education, particularly in higher education, should not be to blindly and unquestioningly perpetuate the market-driven, employment-focused capitalist ideologies that have shaped many areas of pop music education and higher education in recent decades. The impact of such pervasive ideologies go far beyond merely influencing curricular content, encountered by the relatively small number of students who choose to study popular music in higher education. And I believe that there are really clear links between the values and the beliefs and the behaviours that such an approach to education promotes and the myriad social, political, economic and environmental problems that we face globally. All right, so I was really interested to hear Lucy Green mention in her keynote at the start of the conference yesterday that some of the critical theory work that she engaged in earlier in her career, and of course continued throughout, she feels might have been interpreted as negative in some way. And I'm really, really conscious that this presentation could also come across as negative, okay? But I want to make it really clear from the outset that this is not my intention, all right? I'm motivated by a love for our students, for a hope for their emancipation, for our field, and indeed, I'm motivated by a hope for a better future. So whilst my intention is not to be negative, although it could be construed in that way, I do certainly intend to be provocative. And I hope that my critical reading of the current situation can provoke some stimulating debate in this area. And hopefully we'll get at least maybe 10, 15 minutes to have a wee gab about that afterwards. So to reiterate, as you can see from the slides there, I'm going to focus my attention on three key areas today. I'm going to look at the myth of neutrality, I'm going to look at the notion of creativity as a euphemism, and then I'm going to think about the idea of graduates as a precariat class. And I'm going to do that by drawing on the work of Guy Standing, who some of you might know, or at least know his work. So let's get into this idea of this myth of neutrality. I think I just want to headline this kind of with what I'm saying in the title here. We are not neutral, and the we that I'm talking about here is, you know, well, humans really, but in this context, I'm talking about music educators, and I'm talking about pop music educators specifically. We are not neutral, and I really believe that we need to stop pretending that we are. All right, so I'm going to begin this section by drawing on a really nice quote from Paulo Freire from 1997 in his book, Pedagogy of Freedom. And what he says there is, if we have any serious regard for what it means to be human, the teaching of contents cannot be separated from the moral formation of the learners. To educate is essentially to form. Love that quote. And I think that this idea of forming is a really important one, but it's very, very important for us not to read this as educators are molding students, educators are making students conform to what they want them to be. Indeed, far from it. What I really think this is to say instead that the educative experience, in which we are all engaged, is formative in nature. And for me, that just highlights the fact that it would be impossible to conceive of a neutral entity in such contexts. You know, we're all involved in this. We've all got impact. We've all got influence in this situation. So the idea that anyone in that situation could be neutral is ridiculous to me, to be totally frank, as brutal as that might sound. However, in some areas of the academy, and the arts are probably a nice key example of this, to be honest, there's a view that many subjects and the institutions in which they're situated and the subjects are studied are neutral when it comes to social and political influence on the students. Some people would say, and I'm not talking hypothetically here, these are conversations that I've had with people, these are conversations that I've had with really valued colleagues, with dear friends even that work in this profession. Some people would say that teaching people to play a musical instrument or to operate a recording studio or to write songs or whatever it is that we're engaged with in our practice is not political in the way that things like sociology or political science, for instance, or economics might be considered political because of this, the kind of explicit focus that we associate with these areas. Now, I disagree wholeheartedly, and I know a lot of people do, but I think it is important to note that this attitude is a prevalent one. But again, I disagree. And I would argue that such thinking is really problematic and indeed really dangerous on a number of levels, because it fails to acknowledge the broader picture of the social, political and economic landscape in which higher education operates. Now, to look at this next quote on the slides here from Paul Woodford in 2018. In too many cases, intellectual curiosity and political interests are extinguished in schools and universities because those institutions portray themselves as technological, politically neutral, and socially abstract, and thus value-free, when nothing could be further from the truth. Something which I agree with wholeheartedly, and something which I've experienced firsthand in many institutions that I've worked in over the years. So this isn't having a go at any institution, this isn't having a go at any colleagues, but it's just noting the fact that there is this myth of neutrality that seems to be quite prevalent in discourse at the moment. But to me, indeed, the idea that any education could be considered as politically neutral or value-free is preposterous, because neutrality favours and upholds the social and political status quo, which is in and of itself, of course, inherently value-laden. To fail to acknowledge the intrinsic political functions of higher education is to tacitly accept the way that things are and to perpetuate current conditions. By clinging to this illusion of neutrality, some higher educators have abandoned what I see as the responsibility that we have to be the facilitators of critical consciousness within our students and within the societies that we work in. To draw from Giroux now, as you can see on the slides, in 2010, Giroux states, education cannot be neutral. It is always directive in its attempt to teach students to inhabit a particular mode of agency, to enable them to understand the larger world and one's role in it in a specific way. And for me, that's massively important. It is about looking at the world, it's about reading the world, and it's about understanding how we fit into it and what we can do to change situations that we may see require change for our lived experience. So to me, not only are educators unequivocally not neutral, but those who peddle the myths of neutrality, I think, feed students a really convenient and often government imposed, without trying to sound too kind of conspiracy theorist here, but a convenient falsehood that the current way of being is the common sense, to borrow from Gramsci, and that the way things should be, the way that things have always been and are immutable, or worse, even worse to my mind, is that this is the best that things can be, that we've reached an age of progress and a state in the world where things are as good as they're going to get, and we've now reached some sort of political and social maturity. I mean, that's a conversation for a different day, but the idea that things can't change is massively oppressive and something that I think we really need to consider. Such educators that peddle these sort of myths are effectively complicit, I believe, in stripping education of its social function, of foregrounding an instrumentalist approach to education that favours individualistic gains over collective responsibility and social benefits. And to me, this embrace of false neutrality prevents students from looking behind the curtain. Yeah, it prevents students from actually looking at the system that they're engaged in, to see how it works, to figure out the power structures and the dynamics that are at play. And it prevents them from looking behind that curtain and considering the very ideological function of the education in the production and the perpetuation of certain forms of power, knowledge, attitudes, and comprehension of the ways in which the world works and their places within it. So in the context of this pervasive employability agenda, and hopefully you all know what I mean by that, yeah? Certainly in the UK, for those of us who are in the UK, this is a massive thing, partly because of the politics of the Labour government, well, supposedly Labour government of the late 90s and into the kind of 2000s. Without going too much into that, this idea of employability is so sewn into education, and it's so sewn into higher education in those institutions which we call post-92s, yeah, so modern universities, which tend to be the ones in which popular music courses are situated. Again, it's a conversation for another day, but there's a little bit of context there. Within these institutions and within the system that has a pervasive employability agenda, we see higher education having a function and meaning that many, including myself, see as fundamentally oppressive. A problem faced by pop music education, however, particularly in higher education, is that many educators and students alike find it really difficult to consider criticisms, with many struggling to see, or perhaps actively denying to admit, how studying music, right? Studying music, this cool thing that we all do, how studying music could be considered to be anything other than an expressive and creative and collaborative and beautiful, artistic, virtuous pursuit. Now, I'm not suggesting that it's not for a minute, but I'm suggesting that there are a lot of things that surround the actual music, the way that we engage in the transmission and the learning about music, that is problematic. People are really unwilling, it seems, to admit or to even consider the idea that engagement in such a virtuous artistic pursuit could have anything to do with wider socio-political and economic injustices. And I think this is particularly nefarious when we consider pop music courses, which typically have demographics of students who are first to university in their family, for instance, who are people from working class backgrounds, who are people who don't necessarily have the social capital that other people in society do, who are therefore coming into these programs and being indoctrinated into a certain way of being without necessarily benefiting from the wider human values that higher education can provide. And it's just really funny to think that what we're talking about here is this beautiful, creative, fluffy, fuzzy thing that we all do, which is this nice kind of music making and pop music education. But I think part of the problem there is the very word creativity and the way that it's used. And that brings me on to the next area that I want to talk about, because I think creativity is often used euphemistically in these contexts. So to think about this notion of creativity as euphemism then, there's a tendency, I believe, to assume that the purpose of pop music education, particularly in higher education, is to prepare students for employment in the creative industries. All right, so this term creative industries, that'll be very, very familiar to those of us who are in the UK, probably wider, yeah, but again, this comes from this kind of notion that came out in the late 90s in the UK about the creative industries being central to the economy. And I think this is problematic for a number of reasons. So again, to draw on Paul Woodford, he states, if they, and he's talking about universities here, are thought to have any political purpose at all, they now serve primarily capitalist purposes, often in collusion with businesses in confusing job training with education. And I think that's really important, that kind of confusion and mismatch in alignment and mismatch in values that exist between the notion of education for training for the labour market and education as a bigger, wider societal human good. Aidan Harvey, who's one of my students, was talking about this yesterday, and he made this beautiful point about education not necessarily being one or the other, and that people can read it in different ways. But I think the confusion that exists there is something that's at the root of the problem that we're dealing with here. But to go back to this notion or this formation of the term creative industries, I think the linking of the word creative so explicitly to the notion of industry is a really clear indicator that industry preparation is a key aim of many areas of higher education, and that's particularly true in pop music education. You just need to look at the prospectuses that are all about creative industries. You need to look at the departments which these courses often sit in, which are called the creative industries, for instance, in a lot of universities. And I think then it follows, as Ollie Mould suggests, and he's got a book from 2018 called Against Creativity, which is just a wonderful piece of work. It follows, as he suggests, that when we use the term creativity, we seem to do so in a really convenient euphemistic shorthand for capitalistic creativity or capitalist creativity. And what I mean by that is we're using the term creativity essentially to refer to doing or creating services and things that have already been deemed necessary by our neoliberal, market-driven, consumerist society for their exchange value. It's not necessarily about thinking about creativity in a wider sense. It's about packaging the notion of creativity as if to say, do these things that already exist, make records in this way. This is how you create a hit song. This is how to do a video. Again, because what we're trying to do, or I amn't actually, but what a lot of the field is trying to do is say, we're trying to train you for this world that exists beyond this thing that you're in just now. This is universities like this kind of training ground for this industry that you may or may not go into. And I think in doing so, we're training people to operate in that world rather than to think about the bigger world that might be around us. I think links between arts education and creative industries are not simply things that universities peddle to appear attractive to prospective students on their websites and in their departmental names, for instance. And as is discussed in detail by Banks and Hesmondhalgh, a long-held ambition of the UK Labour government, and again, we're going back to the late 90s here. So we're, I mean, I don't know how much this means to an international audience, but we're thinking about people like Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Yeah, so I guess that aligns roughly with the kind of Clinton Bush sort of time frame. Yeah. So hopefully you understand what I mean by that, because there's massive ideological similarities between the two camps. A long-held ambition of the UK Labour government has been to make Britain the world's creative capital, and the creative industries have been identified as the basis of this goal. Certainly in the UK in the late 90s, there was this notion of cool Britannia, yeah, which actually makes me a wee bit sick in my mouth to even say that phrase out loud, to be totally honest with you. But it's associated with this idea that the creative industries are sitting at the centre of our economy. To the extent that the UK's Department for Culture, Media and Sport made it explicit in their publication, which was entitled Creative Britain, and that came out in 2008, so that was in the later period of that government, that the British government's aim is, and I'm going to put this one up on the screen because this just blows my mind, that it's so back to front according to my values, to ensure that academia is equipping students with the skills to make the most effective contribution that they can to the creative economy. All right, not that we're training students to become humans that exist in the world, to shape the world, to act within the world and understand how it works. No, we're training students and equipping students with the skills they need to make a contribution to the economy. To me, that feels back to front. And I think it comes from the fact that the incentive to envisage and to engage in creative work is often framed by universities and governments, as we can see here, in terms of vocationalism. Effectively, students are assured that there's some sort of glamour, there's some sort of joy in being able to make a living from doing the things that you really love, in big inverted commas, you know, being a musician, being a photographer, being a designer, all these things that were kind of touted as the creative employment at that particular time, and have filtered through into most university policy, certainly modern university policy in the UK thereafter. And then stemming from that, we've got this notion that life can be great when you're flexible and when you're your own boss, or when you're, and again, another word that I really hate, an entrepreneur, not an artist, not a musician, an entrepreneur. You know, and I get it, but let's just think about the contemporary context then. Yeah, so as we speak, we're sitting in the midst of the COVID-19 global pandemic. This isn't just a wee thing that's happened for a couple of weeks and we're all still like, oh God, this is new, what are we going to do about this? You know, we're well into the second year of this thing now. And I'm having conversations on what seems like a daily basis with a great many of my students, from recent graduates who are making their living in this precarious way in the creative industries, to students who are hoping to go out into this world. For many, immediately, as soon as this hit, March last year, as soon as this hit, income from gigs, private teaching, studio session work that they might have done has completely and utterly disappeared. And the supposed virtue of flexibility and the beauty of being your own boss is now entirely meaningless in a world in which they've effectively been trained into a position of precarity and conditioned through the normative narrative of neoliberal higher education that this is what they should be aiming for, that this is the goal of their education. Now, we've now seen two full university year groups, two full university year cohorts, who have went from being in a position of approaching the end of their degrees and being presented with this beautiful world of shining promise of going out and being musicians, to effectively now living in their parents' basement and not being able to work in this area that they've studied in, selling their gear, selling their equipment. You know, I kind of say it half in jest, but it's not funny. You know, we're getting students. I've sold my drum kit because I can't afford to have it anymore. I've sold my car because there's not any gigs and I can't afford to run it because I'm staying in my mum's basement. You know, on top of that, a lot of these people have not been able to claim any government assistance because of their lack of a track record in employment, and certainly they don't have much of self-employment history. So they've effectively just been left and abandoned. Now, this is having massive impacts on their lives, on their self-esteems, on their future, of their vision of the world in which they live and how they're going to engage with it as they enter the world. And if our education system is primarily focused on replicating capitalist norms by way of equipping students to contribute to the economy, as per the explicit government statements that I've mentioned a couple of times now and quoted from, then what happens when this version of the economy fails? That's not hypothetical, because look what's happened over the last 15, 16 months now. What happens when it fails? Actually, the situation that I've just described is what happens. And perhaps now is a really important moment for us, and maybe as educators, it's really important for us to reflect on the fact that people live in societies, people don't live in economies. And perhaps even just formulating that in our mind is something that might drive us to think about the world that we live in. Doing the things that you love and being in charge of your own working practices and having relative flexibility in your work compared to, let's use the cliche of 9-to-5 office workers, for example, is appealing to many. Of course it is. Being flexible, not being tied down, not being kind of ruled by the man, all these kind of things. Of course it's appealing. But we really need to note, and we really need to remember that such flexibility and autonomy usually come at a cost, with a great deal of employment activity for these so-called creative entrepreneurs being project-based, being low paid, being short-term, being precarious, being highly competitive. And because they're highly competitive, they're therefore subject to market logic. They're subject to massive negotiation on price. It becomes a race to the bottom for people to engage with the work that they want to do, such that they'll do it for free, they'll do it for nothing, they'll do it for exposure, they'll do it for experience, just so that they can say that they're doing it, regardless of the precariat they're engaged in. And we should also remember that we're exclusive of non-pay benefits, or exclusive of benefits like sick pay, pensions, maternity leaves. And I'm sure a lot of you have probably seen this slide and this meme knocking about. And yeah, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek and a bit cheesy, but it kind of illustrates the point. One guy saying to the other, yeah, it's an unpaid gig, but it'll be great exposure for you. And then the other guy saying, oh yeah, that's perfect. My rent is actually 800 exposures per month. I know it's a silly little slide, but it just encapsulates how ridiculous the situation that we're in is. And I think we find ourselves in a position in which many universities are effectively validating and endorsing this type of lifestyle. In pop music education and in higher education institutions, the idea is often posed that if we teach students to be able to tap into and channel their inner creativity and their entrepreneurship, and I mean, this is Thatcherite language, yeah? This is kind of Reagan-style language. This is seeping into our current discourse. If we teach people to tap into this entrepreneurship, then they'll be able to survive in the creative industries. This, again, to bring it back to the title of this presentation, this again is clearly not neutral in any way, as the world that we live in now is one that's shaped by massive political and economic policies based on austerity politics, certainly since the global financial crash of 2008. So therefore, we're risking students getting the idea. In fact, no, I'm going to back up again. We're kind of risking directly instructing students to adhere to the status quo and to use their skills for individual gain within a hostile free market environment, and to submit to the prevailing context of the industries that our sector seems to blindly venerate, rather than encourage them to critique the world around them. And I say blindly venerate because this seems to be a kind of institutional thing. And when I speak to a lot of people, a lot of educators who are often kind of coming from a kind of liberal artsy sort of background, there aren't many people that say, yeah, the world's great the way it is, and this is the world that we want to perpetuate. Most people will kind of say, God, yeah, it's terrible what's happening. Oh my God, yeah, this kind of inequality is appalling. Yeah, I can see why that's really difficult for the world. Yes, we are having massive impacts on the environment. So it's not as if there's a bunch of kind of dark cloaked nefarious figures who are like Bond villains who are kind of like, haha, let's ruin the world and all the people within it. Of course that's not the case, but when it is filtered through this institutional lens, where we do have governmental policy, where we do have institutional policy impacting on the way in which people behave and the things that we have to teach people because of government diktats, for instance, and targets and this kind of accountability agenda that seems to be going on, we do seem to be in the situation where the institutions are venerating, and therefore the culture's venerating, and effectively over time we are normalizing a situation which I believe to be ultimately, and ultimately is the wrong word, which I to believe unbelievably unjust, problematic and unsustainable, but we're doing so rather than helping students to critique the world around them. And I think that's a massive issue that we really need to think about. So I want to move on now to talk about what creativity could be in that sense. Maybe then creativity that we need to be thinking about is how we can develop and dream up creative ways to exist and to be artists in the world, which encourage equity, which encourage freedom, which encourage humanization, and which encourage environmental care. This might again seem naive, and listen, I'm no stranger to being accused of naivety or being accused of, oh yeah, but the world doesn't like that, son, shut up and get on with it, sort of thing. It might seem naive, or it might seem simplistic, or it might seem to bear the hallmarks of another thing that I'm often accused of, which is utopianism. However, if we really care about the things that we've been talking about, then we need to channel our creativity towards such goals. In that sense, we need to believe in the possibility of the world that we want to see. When we're thinking about creativity within our programs and within the practices of ourselves and our students, in the euphemistic sense that I've outlined previously, we are effectively prevented from envisaging other versions of the world. Rather, we end up reproducing the current situation. In doing so, we replicate the same inequalities and the same injustices and the same precariousness that we've endured for the last couple of centuries, all the while normalizing this, venerating this, and effectively selling this to our students as an ultimate career goal. And it's this precarity and it's this kind of injustice that I want to turn to next, and what it does to our students. And I want to think about this notion of creating a graduate precariat. And I've said actively creating a graduate precariat in the title of this presentation, because I kind of believe, to be honest, that that's what we're doing. I don't think we're doing it deliberately, but I do think we need to spend a lot of time thinking about how we can move away from that model, because we are effectively doing so. Let me get into this a wee bit. I think most popular music education programs that I'm aware of across the sector, and I mean that internationally, are at least in part explicitly professing to train graduates for employment in the ways noted above. All right, now not everyone's doing that, and not every member of staff within that institution is, but I think we'd all agree that that is a dominant narrative. Yeah, this is about training people to engage within the creative industries. However, the aforementioned precarious entrepreneurship and unstable labour that we've described often go hand in hand with uncertain living conditions based on insecurity, and have little or no access to non-wage benefits, as we've already discussed. Right, so not only does this lead to a situation in which people are conditioned to believe that they should dedicate what amounts to considerable amounts of their non-employment time, yeah, their leisure time, if you want to use a different phrase, to find them work, thus effectively working for free to secure employment, it also risks significant negative effects on their health and on their mental well-being. So this term precariat, I mean, it floats around in sociology a lot, certainly, but I'm wanting to draw on Guy Standing, who's got a lot, he writes a lot about this, and he's got a book called the creation of a new precariat class, or something to that effect. I've just butchered the title, apologies. But he also, within the work that I've read of his, he brings about this notion of the precariotized mind. Now, I'm going to bring up a quote from him in a minute, and I just think it is so powerful. And it's so powerful because of the way it's expressed, but I think it's also so powerful because I recognize it. I fully understand it, and I believe that I've lived it, and I believe that most of my students live and experience it. He says, the precariotized mind is associated with anxiety, chronic insecurity, associated not only with teetering on the edge, knowing that one mistake or one piece of bad luck could tip the balance between between modest dignity and being a bag lady. Right, so I want to distance myself slightly from the language bag lady. I don't know how familiar people are with this term, but it's, you know, not a particularly nice description of maybe homeless people or people who've got nomadic lifestyles, people who you see carrying their bags around cities because they have nowhere to live. But the point he makes is a beautiful one, I think, yeah? And we think, okay, what does one piece of bad luck or what does one mistake make? And we think, well, that could be anything, that could be individual choice. But then what does it mean when we think about it in the context of the pandemic? That's global bad luck that is now trundled on for over a year, and we are very aware of the fact that this is the bad luck that has tipped some people over the edge. He goes on and he says people are insecure in their mind and stressed. At the same time, they're underemployed and they're overemployed. Yeah, they're underemployed because they're not making enough money from the work that they're doing, but they're overemployed because of the amount of time that they are spending seeking employment but not being paid for it. They're alienated from their labour and their work, and they're anomic, uncertain and desperate in their behaviour. People who fear losing what they have are constantly frustrated. The precariatized mind is fed by fear and is motivated by fear. All right, that's pretty powerful stuff to me. And as I say, I recognise it. I mean, I recognise it for myself. I'm a pop music graduate many moons ago now, obviously, but I recognise that. I recognise that even as many of us will from my time as a kind of, you know, fixed term lecturer or lecturer teaching at a number of institutions trying to get a kind of tenured contract, to use the language of the United States. This is really problematic, but I think that we really need to ask ourselves some questions about this, because I see this so closely aligned to the people that I'm working with. And that's across a number of institutions over the years. And I see it when I speak to colleagues about the students they're working with in their institutions. I think that we educators really need to ask ourselves whether or not we support the status quo. If we find ourselves positioned uncomfortably, as I certainly do, within the current socioeconomic situation and the inequalities and the injustices, and again, across these various different groups that I've talked about, that it creates for the majority of people in our societies, and if we struggle morally and philosophically with the way in which many forms of education bolster and perpetuate that situation, then I think we really need to strongly consider the potency of our own influence and examine our own educational practices. Again, to pull from Paulo Freire in 1985, he states in one sentence, there are no neutral educators. We need to ask ourselves, what are we doing to either support or disrupt this situation? The more that educators encourage people towards this precariatized life, which I really believe as a field we do, and I'm not calling out any individuals here because I don't believe it's an individual issue, but as a field, I do believe we push people towards this precariatized life. Often by perpetuating the myth that this is how it has to be, or by selling that this is the aim for musicians, the greater a disservice we do to our students and to wider society by framing education as preparing students for labour over humanisation. Now, of course, some people want to do this work, and many find it exciting and engaging. I'd like to make it really clear that this isn't an attack on any individual that chooses to engage with this way of working. As a young musician, I found this way of working to be hugely appealing, and I was able to support myself and pay for my postgraduate studies and for my doctorate studies by existing and working and engaging with the world in this way. But when I look back, I was undoubtedly indoctrinated by my undergraduate studies in popular music performance and my professional practice in this area. And it took me a number of years of critical reflection on what and how I was taught and what and how I was existing as an undergraduate to understand that my experience was very, very clearly shaped by an economic and political force that I profoundly disagree with. Nonetheless, though, educators have a responsibility to engage with inherently political situations in which we find ourselves and encourage students and colleagues to be fully aware of it. We should be alerting those that we work with and those that we teach and those who we engage with to the illusion of this neutrality and helping them to read the world so that they can critically reflect on the wider social, political and economic situation and their place within it. I'm not saying that we indoctrinate them all to a Marxist view of the world. What I'm saying is we need to encourage them to think about the situation that they find themselves in and ask themselves, look in the mirror. We all need to do this as often as possible as reflective practitioners. Do we agree with the situation and do we agree with the way in which we're contributing to it? Thus, we as educators need to facilitate the creation of a critical culture which ensures that pop music education is not simply a mechanism for the tacit perpetuation and rationalisation of an unjust social, political and economic reality. Now, I really am a firm believer in trying to find solutions wherever possible. And I'm also really aware, having said that this presentation has mainly been an exploration of the problems. And hopefully we've got a wee bit of time now for discussion about some of the ways that we can go forward. However, I do think, though, that it is massively important for us to be able to name and to fully understand the problems, lest we end up being perpetrators of false generosity, lest we end up papering over the cracks, dealing with people's symptoms, but not actually dealing with the systemic causes of the problems and the issues. So whilst I've not necessarily talked about any solutions, I do believe that the first and indeed one of the most important steps towards solutions is to start to have these massively uncomfortable discussions and to really examine our practices and normative behaviours as educators and ask ourselves, what are the effects of our practices, attitudes, relationships and philosophies, and how do these contribute to the world that we want to live in? I don't think it's naive or idealistic to suggest that it is within our power to start sowing the seeds of the world that we want, to imagine a different future by exposing the contradictions that we live by and developing a formative culture in which our students feel empowered to begin to transform the appalling, unjust, dangerous and violent present that we are currently experiencing in the hope of a better future, which places the common good, equity, social, political and environmental justice at the heart of our experience. Educators are not neutral, our disciplines are not neutral, and failing to acknowledge the implicit influence of our actions on students, their view of the world and their place within it is, I believe, a dereliction of our duty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for possible discussions or questions. If anyone has one, you could unmute or you could message something in the chat. Oh, okay. We have.
Thank you, Zach. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
So I really appreciated your talk. I thought it was really interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So you talked about how graduates have been, all musicians, maybe especially recent graduates, have been cheated through their education into kind of being especially precarious in the current pandemic. And I'm wondering, you said you didn't have any answers, so I'm going to ask you for one. How would your kind of idealized utopian liberatory pedagogy have better prepared people to cope with a pandemic than we've been able to?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. So I think there's a couple of issues at play, right? So I think the first one is no one saw, well, there are questions about whether people saw this coming or not, but let's just believe that no one saw this coming. This was kind of something that was sprung on the world, and there's nothing that we could do about it. Yeah, so we're all on the back foot. There's nothing that can really happen. And who's to say that if we had trained people in a different way that they would have been able to thrive? We don't know that. We don't have any kind of crystal ball scenario. Yeah, but I think what is important to note though is that so much of the instrumental, which always sounds like a horrible pun when we're talking about music education, yeah, but so much of this kind of instrumental approach to education and this kind of teleological thing of we are going to train you for this thing. Incidentally, this thing that we think the world is based on 4 years ago when we designed the degree that you're about to complete. I think the fact that we're training people for one instance and one way to exist and one way to work in the world is really problematic. And we're also kind of spreading this narrative of, you know, some of you will go out and be musicians, but some of you won't. So we'll teach you how to set up gigs and we'll teach you how to do sound engineering and all that kind of thing. So whatever we're doing, we're training people for some sort of vision of the world that may or may not exist. So I think what we need to do is reverse from that, because let's face it, and I don't mean to do a disservice to our profession, pop music existed long before we started calling ourselves pop music educators, and it'll damn sure exist a long time after we've decided whatever we think this field is going to be. Yeah, most of the people that we point to as our heroes and the people that we point to as the kind of leading lights in our field didn't study music. You know, they've got no interest in working in that way. So their creativity and their way of working in the world hasn't been hampered by the constrictions that are put in place by education. So if we strip some of them away, if we just teach people how to kind of critique the world, how to think about the world, they're going to be learning music, they're going to be making music, they're going to be engaging in that world anyway. So we can maybe teach them to think about ways to help to change the world such that when things do go wrong, not only have they a wider skill set, but the whole notion of education isn't predicated on them just being able to wield a skill set at the end of the day anyway. So you might then say, so what's the point in going to university? Well, I certainly don't think it's to train people to get a job. Absolutely don't, because I think that's going to be happening anyway. So my utopia would be one that was taken away from the teleological view of education as something that supports employment and put in towards a view of education that uses music as a lens to view the world through, to act musically, to think musically, to behave musically in a world to make it a better place. And that's why I get accused of utopianism.
Thank you, Zach. I've got to go and get ready for my own presentation now. Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for coming along. Good to see you, man. Take care.
You have a question also in the chat from Brad, Kate, and James, if you want to read it.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, you guys are in Sydney. Is it super late or super early there? Or somewhere in between?
It is currently 5:20 in the morning. We've been going since midnight.
Oh, wow. I really appreciate you guys hanging around to see this. Thank you so much for taking the time. What rethinking creativity might really look like, and also you'd like to know who are all the people in the photos are. We have about half of them. Oh, cool. We'll go back to that and we'll play the game show Name the Marxists in a wee minute. What would rethinking creativity, what would it look like? I think it would look like, and by the way, if people haven't read this book, I might even have it in my bag. I really enjoy it a lot. A book called Against Creativity by Ollie Mould, which you can't see because I've got a filter on, but that's what it's called. It's really cool, really, really interesting. He's a geographer and he kind of looks at how cities and how the world's built and what notions of creativity mean. And that's kind of who I'm drawn on for that theoretical idea of creativity being capitalistic in nature. So if we rethink creativity, it could be simply about saying, okay, let's take away the templates, let's take away the cookie cutters that we probably unwittingly, but definitely give to our students. You know, you will submit by the end of this module a 3.5-minute pop song, because 3.5 minutes is how long pop songs last. We might also take away the fact that it needs to have drums, bass, guitar, keys, vocals, harmonies, fade out, key change, you know, all these sorts of things. Now we teach that sort of stuff and we call it creativity. You know, we talk about that as the creative work that we do. I teach a lot of composition and certainly I've been trying to move away from saying composition is this thing and this is how you do it. And here's how you make hits, kids. Because A, firstly, I've never made any hits, so who the hell am I to say that? B, who am I to tell them whether their work's good or not? Because I'm also not the guy that decides whose work's good or not. And I don't believe it's my place to do so. So one of the ways that I'm going about doing it is saying, right, let's take away the constraints. We can put them back in if people need crutches to kind of start out that journey, but let's take away the constraints about what the end point is so that we can say, this is up to you. Creativity is about looking in yourself and doing something that gives you a musicking experience, yeah, that stimulates you aesthetically. I don't care if it conforms to the notions of what might sell or not. I don't care if it's 20 minutes long, but the assessment only asked for a 5-minute piece. I then get them to mark their own work. So I never have any input on marking their composition. All the way through the university, they decide what their mark is for the composition. Because again, excuse me, my language, but who the hell am I to tell them whether it's good or not? You know, I don't want to be some sort of ridiculous Simon Cowell figure or you know, kind of like 80s businessman with a cigar sort of thing, like, hey kids, it's all good. That makes no sense to me. So I think stripping out the capitalistic constraints that we have, that we currently think encompass creativity, is the first way to do that. But then I think it's much bigger than that. It's about looking to how we can engage in the world in a different way. How can we actually change the relationships that we have that are keeping very certain groups of people in their place? Now, those groups might be racial groups, those groups might be sexual groups, gendered groups, class groups, but we have massive functions of social reproduction in place in the education system that we have. So one of the first things that I think creativity could do is to move forward and break down some of those issues in the hope that we can humanize everyone, not just those who are set up to engage and thrive within the system that we currently have. Oh, and Tom, thank you, man. I see you've just put in the chat the link to the book. I appreciate that. Thank you. Happy to answer any other questions, but if people want to discuss anything or whatever, if we've got a couple of minutes, that would be cool.
So I'm wondering, Zach, thank you for the notion of neutral, like being neutral in the classroom. I actually I'm teaching language as well, and I feel like a lot of textbooks also just shy away from religion or political issues just to stay on sort of the global perspective, and then being able to sell their textbooks worldwide as well. And I was wondering if you had any advice if teachers are, maybe too involved in teaching or have a lot of workload, so they don't go into a lot of details or shy away from issues in the classroom just because they don't feel very comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get that. And I think I've just got a policy of not shying away from anything, but that's not for a minute to suggest that I'm an expert on everything, so should be talking about everything. Not that at all. What I mean by it is I actively don't shut down things in the classroom because there are some people that want to talk about it. Of course, I'll chair things and I'll make sure that people are being respectful and whatever. But I think any time that I step in and steer the direction in a certain way, I'm making a political and a value-based judgment about what I think should be discussed in my classroom. Right. And of course, that's going to come from my tradition and my history and my background and my ontology, if you like. Yeah. And that's going to be as a kind of white, straight guy in his 30s who leans to the Marxist side of things, you know. But then what I'm doing is alienating other people from coming into that conversation if I take the reins and I lead that. So I think it's about not professing expertise. And I think when you step back from a position of expertise, and you say that if I have any clout in this room, it's in the facilitation of a critical consciousness, then what you do is you allow the discussions to happen, and then we find ways to deal with them afterwards should there be any fallout. And I do that a lot in classes, and I really don't have any problem with it. But I used to. And I used to be worried about it, and I used to be worried about the repercussions of it. But I think it's about fostering that culture whereby people believe and understand that this is how the situation's working, this is how the relationships are going to work. And when we have these relationships in the classroom, it becomes a much more trusting place in which people can bring anything to the table that they want.
So, Zach, when we strip out those constraints around the creative process, what, if anything, do we put back in? And I'm thinking about that blank page fever when we say to students, go over there and create something. And I'm kind of trying to get to so we've stripped it out. There's no constraints. You can do anything you want. What do we put back in? And I'm kind of driving to then perhaps what's the role of the educator?
Yeah.
In this strength environment.
Great question. Thank you so much. And I feel we've not got time to do it justice, so I'd love to maybe chat about this more as we go forward. It's about stripping out the structures that make people behave in certain ways, I think, right? So yeah, absolutely. We do get the fear of the blank page or the fear of the blank DAW screen, yeah? An empty Pro Tools session freaks people out as much as anything else. I absolutely understand that. I think it's not necessarily about always creating that blank page. So it could be about just placing the student in the center of that world. Yeah, so it's about stripping out the context rather than stripping out any instruction. So by that, I mean, it's about saying, right, okay, you're going to make a piece about your world and it's going to only use found sounds, or you're going to make a piece about your world and it's only going to use words from your dialect and, you know, whatever it might be. So it's putting them at the center and me saying it's not right or wrong, depending on which way you go for it. It's about you learning. You know, I don't want to use the word journey because it's so cliched and cheesy, but it's about the journey of doing the thing and learning and developing the metacognition around what you've engaged with rather than what the product is at the end, because I really don't believe in good or bad music. Again, I'd love to talk more about this with you afterwards, but I think the other thing is, and the really important question that you asked is, what's the role of the educator? And I say this to my students all the time, and they kind of laugh at me in first year. And then by fourth year, they kind of like, see that thing you said to us a few years ago? I get it now. I honestly, and don't tell my boss this because I actually quite like having a salary, but I honestly believe that the function of the educator is to make themselves redundant as soon as possible. Right, to make themselves redundant in, not in employment terms, obviously, but in the journey of the student, so that you are eventually you're just becoming that guide on the side. You are just that kind of person that sits alongside them on their journey, that if they need to turn around and ask you a wee question, they do. You know, you're maybe the navigator in the co-pilot seat, and if they want to ask you something and they want your advice and they want your feedback, you're there to give it to them, but you're not there to tell them what to do. You're not there to validate their experience. You're not there to validate their learning. You're there to facilitate their learning and maybe to kind of shine a torch into the corners that they might not have noticed yet, that you have noticed because you've already been in that dark corner of that room, and you can kind of take them to that place if they want to go there, not because you've got a preset route map that they need to follow, because that is, I believe, the kind of root of an oppressive approach to education.
That's beautiful.
I think
And I
that's
think it gets us
exactly how much time we have.
I'm
for
sorry.
questions. I'm so sorry that we have to move on, but I really appreciate it, Zach, and the questions were amazing to make the discussion very interesting after the presentation. So
Thank you so much for the interesting questions. And my details are on the screen. I don't know if you can, you can't still see that, but my details are there. If anyone wants to get in touch with me, I'd love to hear from you, whether it's to have a nice chat or whether it's for you to shout at me and tell me you disagree. I'm happy either way. It would just be love to hear from you. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me, and especially those who are around the world in unsociable hours. Thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you so much, Zach. We really appreciate it.